Chapter 1. The Descent into Madness. Part 1. A New Resolve. Raskolnikov stood in front of his window, staring blankly at the gray, rain-drenched streets of St. Petersburg. His mind felt like a whirlwind, chaotic, confused, yet undeniably focused. The quiet of his room, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. His thoughts had become a tangled web, each one more dangerous than the last. He had spent days avoiding the inevitable, trying to convince himself that he had a choice, that he could walk away from the path he had set. But deep down, he knew he could not. The decision was made. The weight of it pressed heavily on him as he paced the small room, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. The night felt endless, and with each passing hour, the inevitability of his choice became clearer. "I can't keep running," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. He was ready now. The justification, the reasoning, he had crafted them all. The act would be a service to society, a way to rid the world of someone who had caused suffering to so many. Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker, would be the first. The thought had grown, evolved. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about power. The power to shape his own fate, to rid himself of the chains that bound him to a life of poverty and despair. But as he closed his eyes, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He could feel the weight of the decision like a physical force. The act itself was still distant, still theoretical, but it was drawing nearer. Soon, he would no longer be able to escape. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. This was it. Part 2. The plan unfolds. Raskolnikov's thoughts were like a storm, each gust of wind pulling him in a different direction. He had been preparing for this moment for days, gathering the necessary tools: an axe, a piece of cloth to cover his hands, and the strength to face what he could not avoid. He had convinced himself that he was justified, that this was the only way to escape his misery. The morning light filtered through the grimy window, casting a pale, sickly glow on the room. It was time to go. There was no turning back now. He could already see the pawnshop in his mind. The dark wooden door, the small, dimly lit space inside, and the old woman, hunched over her desk, counting her coins. Her voice echoed in his head, mocking him. "What are you waiting for, boy? Come on in. I'll take whatever you've got." Raskolnikov had heard those words 100 times, but now they sounded different. They were a challenge he could no longer ignore. His hands trembled as he gathered the items he needed, slipping them into his coat. The weight of the axe against his side felt both comforting and terrifying. Was this really who he had become? He tried to shake the question from his mind, but it lingered like an unwelcome guest. His stomach twisted in knots, but he pushed forward, out of the room and into the streets. Every step felt heavier than the last. The sounds of the city were muted, like the world was holding its breath. He passed the familiar shops, the bustling markets, the beggars who asked for his spare change, all unaware of the dark purpose he carried with him. As he neared the pawn shop, his pace quickened. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the footsteps echoing through the empty streets. He could feel the moment drawing closer, and yet, a part of him still hesitated. But there was no turning back now. Part 3. Crossing the Threshold. Raskolnikov stood in front of the pawn shop, his breath shallow, his hands cold and slick with sweat. The door loomed before him, an immovable barrier between his thoughts and the irreversible act he was about to commit. He glanced up at the sign, its faded letters barely visible against the brick wall. Alyona Ivanovna's pawn shop. The name seemed to mock him, as if daring him to proceed. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He tried to steady himself, telling himself that this was the only way. This would be his liberation. But the doubts crept back in, the whispers in his mind louder than ever. What if he failed? What if he couldn't go through with it? What if she fought back? He reached for the door handle, but his hand trembled violently. It felt as if the world around him had frozen in place, as if time itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of life in the city faded, replaced by the deafening sound of his own heartbeat. Suddenly, the door creaked open slightly, and a figure appeared in the shadowed doorway, a familiar face. It was Lizaveta, Alyona Ivanovna's younger sister. Raskolnikov froze. She was here, and her presence shattered his fragile resolve. Lizaveta, kind and gentle, who had always been a quiet presence in his life, never asking for anything, never demanding. She was the complete opposite of her sister, soft, innocent, and untainted by the harshness of the world. What was she doing here? This was not part of the plan. Lizaveta stepped forward, her face brightening as she caught sight of him. "Oh, Raskolnikov, I didn't expect to see you today. Are you here to see Alyona?" Her words felt like a punch to the gut. Raskolnikov couldn't speak. His throat was tight, and the world felt as if it were spinning out of control. Was this a sign? Could he still go through with it? Part 4. A moment of hesitation. Raskolnikov stared at Lizaveta, his mind a blur. She smiled innocently, her face glowing with a warmth that seemed so out of place in the dark alley outside the pawnshop. His heart raced, pounding against his chest as if it were trying to escape. What was he doing? What had he planned? He could feel his hand instinctively tighten around the handle of the axe hidden beneath his coat. Was this really the right thing to do? The familiar sense of justification, the rationale that had fueled his actions, now seemed distant, swallowed by the quiet purity of Lizaveta's gaze. Raskolnikov? Lizaveta's voice was soft, a hint of concern creeping into her tone as she noticed his distress. "Are you all right? You look pale." He had never imagined it would come to this. She had always been so kind to him, too kind. Her gentle nature made it impossible for him to imagine her as a threat or an obstacle. Yet, here she was, a part of the very plan he had concocted. Could he really harm her too? The thought of it turned his stomach. Alyona Ivanovna was one thing. He had dehumanized her in his mind, convinced himself that she was a source of evil. But Lizaveta? She was innocent. She had never wronged him. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and he felt the crushing weight of his own uncertainty. What would happen if he couldn't follow through? If he backed out now, there would be no turning back. His entire existence, his plan, would unravel. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His thoughts were too jumbled. His gaze darted to the door of the pawnshop, then back to Lizaveta. She was still waiting for him to answer. Could he live with the choice he had made? Or was this the moment he would finally abandon it all? Part 5. The breaking point. Raskolnikov's mind was a maelstrom, his thoughts crashing into each other, pulling him in 1,000 different directions. Lizaveta's soft eyes, filled with concern, burned into him, forcing him to confront the very heart of his plan. Could he really do it? Could he become the person he had convinced himself he was? Someone who could take another life without hesitation, without remorse? The words he had rehearsed, the justifications he had built, all seemed so fragile in this moment. The reality of what he was about to do had never felt so real, so visceral. Lizaveta, standing before him in her innocence, was a sharp reminder of everything he was about to destroy. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to her? What excuse could he offer for the darkness that was about to consume him? Lizaveta took a step closer, her hand reaching out to him. Raskolnikov, you're scaring me. Please, tell me what's wrong. You look so lost. Her touch was light, almost ethereal. It was enough to snap him out of his stupor. For a moment, he forgot everything. The axe, the plan, the life he had convinced himself he had to take. In that moment, all he could feel was the weight of his own failure. But it was too late for redemption. The moment of hesitation was gone, swallowed by the deep, gnawing emptiness that had been growing inside him for so long. In an instant, his mind snapped back to the reality of the situation. He had come here for a reason. He had come to end it, to break free. With a final, shallow breath, Raskolnikov pushed past Lizaveta and stepped into the pawn shop. He had no more excuses, no more time. The die had been cast. The heavy door swung shut behind him, and the silence in the room felt suffocating. Chapter 2. The Consequence of Action. Part 1. The Cold Stroke of Fate. The pawn shop was as he remembered it, dim, cramped, filled with the musty scent of old furniture and faded tapestries. The familiar hum of the city outside was muffled, distant, as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. Inside, the air was thick with tension, and it felt as though time itself had slowed. Alyona Ivanovna sat at her desk, hunched over as usual, counting coins. The rhythmic clink of metal against wood echoed in the silence. She didn't look up when he entered, absorbed in her task. For a moment, Raskolnikov hesitated, standing at the threshold of the room. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. He had crossed the point of no return. There was no way back now. His grip tightened around the axe hidden beneath his coat. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn away, to run. But he couldn't. He stepped forward, his footsteps unervingly loud on the wooden floor. The sound seemed to echo in his mind, magnified, until it was all he could hear. Each step felt like a step closer to his doom, or perhaps his destiny. Alyona finally looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she saw him approach. She didn't recognize the nervous tension in his face. To her, he was just another customer, another poor soul hoping to pawn something of little value. "What is it, young man?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he pulled the axe from beneath his coat, and in a single, violent motion, he struck. The sound of the blow was muffled, swallowed by the small, cramped room. Alyona crumpled to the ground, her blood staining the floor beneath her. Raskolnikov stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the act crashing down on him. His mind screamed, but his body remained motionless, locked in place by the gravity of what he had just done. What had he done? The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he stared at the body before him, unable to process the reality of the murder he had committed. The plan, the justification, all of it now seemed meaningless. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. But even as the horror of his actions began to settle in, Raskolnikov knew something deeper was stirring inside him, something darker. The consequences had only just begun. Part 2. The Weight of Guilt. Raskolnikov stood frozen, his body trembling as he looked down at the lifeless form of Alyona Ivanovna. The room, once filled with the dull sounds of her counting coins, was now eerily silent. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hands slick with sweat. The axe, still gripped in his fingers, felt foreign, as though it didn't belong to him. The blood was spreading across the floor, slowly soaking into the cracks in the wood, a cruel reminder of what he had just done. His mind spun in a disjointed frenzy, unable to grasp the enormity of his actions. Had he really killed her? The question echoed through his thoughts, louder and louder, until it became all-consuming. But there was no time to dwell on it, no time for remorse. He had to finish what he had started. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to conceal the crime. The pawn shop, with its cluttered shelves of forgotten items, seemed like a labyrinth, each corner offering potential refuge for his guilt. He couldn't leave evidence behind. Raskolnikov moved mechanically, as though his body was acting without his consent. He grabbed a piece of cloth from the desk and wiped the axe clean, then quickly discarded it behind a pile of old books. His mind was a blur, but instinct had taken over. Get rid of the evidence. Disappear. He rushed to the back of the shop, where Alyona had kept her stash of valuables. The money. The justification. He filled his pockets with coins, rings, and a few precious trinkets. But as he moved, a voice echoed in his mind, one he couldn't silence, no matter how hard he tried. What had he become? Was this really his salvation, or had he just sealed his fate? The door behind him creaked open, and Raskolnikov froze. He had forgotten about Lizaveta. She had been outside, waiting. The reality of his crime crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Lizaveta, sweet and innocent, had no idea of the darkness that had just unfolded in her sister's home. As the door opened fully, Lizaveta stepped inside, her face lighting up when she saw him. Raskolnikov, what's going on? What's happening? But the look on his face, pale, panicked, was enough to send a chill through her. She paused, looking at the blood on the floor, the scene unfolding before her eyes. For a split second, everything seemed to stop, and in that moment, Raskolnikov knew his fate had shifted once more. Part 3. The Unraveling. Lizaveta's eyes widened as she took in the scene. The blood pooling on the floor, the glint of coins scattered haphazardly across the desk, and Raskolnikov, standing frozen in the center of it all. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking violently as he wiped them against his coat, trying, in vain, to rid himself of the blood that seemed to coat his very soul. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke. Lizaveta's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked from the lifeless body of her sister to Raskolnikov, as if trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding before her eyes. Raskolnikov. Her voice was soft, trembling. What have you done? The question cut through him like a blade. The reality of what he had just committed began to settle on him, not as a mere theory but as something undeniable, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. His heart pounded so hard it felt as though it would burst, but his mind felt distant, detached. What had he become? He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to explain, to justify, but there was nothing he could say. How could he? There was no explanation for this, no logic that could make this right. Lizaveta took a tentative step toward him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what had driven him to this madness. Raskolnikov, please, say something. What happened? Why her? Her voice was filled with anguish and disbelief, and Raskolnikov felt his insides twist in a knot. The girl, the one person who had never wronged him, who had always been kind, was now standing before him, watching as the consequences of his actions unraveled everything. The sound of his name, spoken with such innocence, was too much. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had done. I, I, I didn't mean, his voice cracked, unable to form coherent words. But even as he tried to speak, the truth loomed over him. There was no going back. Lizaveta, still frozen in place, suddenly looked towards the door, as though the reality of the situation was dawning on her. Her gaze shifted back to Raskolnikov. You can't leave. Please, tell me what happened." But as the room filled with silence once more, something else began to break within him. The realization that his life, the life he had known, was no longer his own. Part 4. The Point of No Return. Raskolnikov could hear his heartbeat in his ears, so loud it drowned out Lizaveta's frantic words, the air thick with tension. He couldn't escape the suffocating weight of the truth, the overwhelming guilt that gripped him. His body trembled as though he were freezing, even as the sweat poured down his face. What had he done? Lizaveta stepped back, her eyes wide with terror. She must have seen something in his face, something dark that confirmed her worst fears. She stumbled backward, shaking her head as though trying to deny what was unfolding before her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't be. Raskolnikov, please tell me you didn't." The words, harsh and cold, seemed to echo through the room. They were a knife to his soul. But how could he lie now? How could he deny what had already happened, what he had already done? There was no way to escape the consequences anymore. His mind was a jumbled mess of conflicting thoughts, but one thing was clear. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had taken a life, and now it was only a matter of time before the world would find out. Raskolnikov stood up shakily, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He looked at Lizaveta, her face pale and horrified. The weight of her gaze felt like a punishment in itself. He had seen her only moments ago as the sweet, innocent woman she was, but now she had become a part of his nightmare, a part of the mess he had created. I didn't mean to. I thought. His words faltered, nothing more than fragments of his broken reasoning. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Lizaveta backed away, her face stricken with disbelief and fear. She turned to the door, but before she could reach it, Raskolnikov made a split-second decision. Panic surged through him as he realized he could not let her leave. If she went to the authorities, if she told anyone, he was finished. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm with more force than he intended. "Don't," he hissed, his voice almost a growl. "Please, Lizaveta, you can't." Her eyes filled with confusion and terror. "Raskolnikov, what are you doing? Let me go." But Raskolnikov, driven by a rush of fear and desperation, didn't release his grip. For the briefest moment, he considered letting her go, but the crushing weight of his actions, the fear of being caught, overcame all reason. His hands shook uncontrollably, and in a single, reckless movement, everything spiraled out of control. Part 5. The Final Descent. Raskolnikov's grip on Lizaveta tightened, his fingers digging into her delicate arm. He could see the fear in her eyes, the confusion and horror that only deepened with every passing second. He wanted to stop, wanted to let her go, but the desperation inside him, the fear of being caught, overpowered every shred of compassion he had once known. He had to make her stay quiet. "Please, Lizaveta, you don't understand," he muttered, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "You can't leave. You can't tell anyone. Don't make me do something worse." She struggled against his hold, But Raskolnikov's grip was unrelenting. Her face twisted in terror as she tried to break free, but she couldn't. It was as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them, locked in this awful struggle, her fight for freedom and his fight to escape the terrible consequences of his actions. Raskolnikov, she gasped, her voice desperate, almost breaking. Please, let me go. I won't tell anyone. Just let me go. But the words didn't reach him. The dark thoughts that had consumed him for so long, the justification he had built up, had taken root deep inside him. The idea that he could still escape, that he could prevent her from unraveling everything, was too powerful to ignore. His mind whirled, and in the midst of the chaos, he felt the cold, horrible truth seep into him. He had no choice anymore. The act was done. His life was now nothing but a series of irreversible decisions, each one leading him further into darkness. With a final, impulsive action, Raskolnikov pushed Lizaveta away, but in doing so, she lost her balance and fell hard to the ground. The thud of her body hitting the floor echoed in the room. Raskolnikov stood frozen, his heart pounding, as he stared at her crumpled form. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, Raskolnikov approached her, his legs shaking beneath him. As he crouched next to her, he could feel the depth of his actions, the irreversible nature of what he had just done. The world around him seemed to fall away as his guilt enveloped him entirely. Lizaveta lay motionless, her face pale and lifeless. In that moment, Raskolnikov realized the full scope of his crimes. Not only had he murdered Alyona, but in a moment of panic, he had also taken Lizaveta's life, too. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against his chest. There was no escape. Raskolnikov stumbled back, his breaths ragged, his body trembling as though it might collapse at any moment. The weight of his actions, the weight of his soul, felt unbearable. He had crossed every boundary, had shattered his own humanity, and as he turned to flee, he knew that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would never be free from what he had done. His descent into madness was complete. Chapter 3: The Aftermath. Part 1: The Burden of Silence. Raskolnikov stumbled out of the pawnshop, his legs unsteady beneath him. The cold, sharp air of the city bit at his skin, but it did nothing to clear the fog in his mind. His thoughts were scattered, a whirlwind of panic, guilt, and disbelief. His hands, stained with blood, trembled uncontrollably, yet he couldn't bring himself to look at them. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the last. The weight of the crime, no, the crimes, hung heavy around him like an invisible cloak. What now? He couldn't go back to his apartment, not after what had happened. The city, so familiar to him only hours ago, now felt like a labyrinth, a place where he could be trapped forever. He needed to disappear, to flee, to escape from everything. But where would he go? How could he hide from the consequences of his actions? Raskolnikov's mind raced. He had planned everything so meticulously. The murder of Alyona, the justification he had built for himself, the belief that he could take a life without consequence. But none of that mattered now. The reality was far darker, far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. As he walked aimlessly through the streets, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The eyes of the city seemed to follow him, the shadows pressing in on him from all sides. He could almost hear the whispering voices, the murmurs of people who knew, who could sense the darkness inside him. His heart raced as he turned a corner, seeking refuge in the shadows. Would they come for him? Would the authorities soon come knocking at his door? The weight of his silence, the decision to conceal the truth, felt suffocating. Every moment felt like a ticking clock, each second bringing him closer to the inevitable reckoning. In his mind, the vision of Lizaveta's lifeless body was burned into his consciousness. Her eyes, so full of fear and confusion, haunted him. How could he have done that? How could he have taken 2 lives, destroyed 2 futures, and left nothing but emptiness in his wake? The silence around him felt deafening. No one approached him. No one stopped to ask if he was okay. The city continued on, indifferent to his suffering, to his descent into madness. But inside, he knew. He was no longer the same. End of Part 1. Part 2. The Weight of Guilt. Raskolnikov wandered through the streets like a man without a soul, each step heavier than the last. His mind felt fragmented, like broken pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. The weight of the murders, Alyona's and now Lizaveta's, crushed him from all sides. He tried to shake the images from his mind, but they clung to him like shadows. Lizaveta's face, pale and lifeless, stared at him in every reflection, in every passing window. He could still hear the sound of her fall, the thud echoing in his head. The city around him seemed to blur. People moved past him, their faces strangers, their lives continuing as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. A part of him wished someone would notice him, that someone would stop him in his tracks and ask him what was wrong. But no one did. No one cared. And why should they? To them, he was just another person, another figure lost in the crowd. He found himself at a small cafe, unable to remember how he had gotten there. The smell of freshly baked bread and the murmur of voices inside did nothing to calm the storm inside him. Raskolnikov stepped in, taking a seat at an empty table in the corner, his hands shaking as he tried to steady them. The cup of tea before him seemed to mock him, its warmth doing little to comfort him. He couldn't drink. His throat was too tight, his heart too heavy. He needed to be alone, but even in the solitude, he wasn't free from his thoughts. Every creak of the wooden floor, every passing voice outside, made him jump. Someone was bound to notice. Someone was bound to find out. He could already hear the knock on his door, the authorities coming to take him away. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the cafe. He didn't want to face the truth. He had murdered 2 people, but it was inescapable. The guilt gnawed at him like a constant, growing ache. His mind flashed back to the moment with Lizaveta. He had seen her fear, her confusion, and yet he had done nothing to stop. It was as if he had become a stranger to himself, someone completely detached from any semblance of morality. He had told himself he was doing the right thing, that he was justified, but now those thoughts seemed hollow, meaningless. What had he become? Suddenly, a noise in the cafe broke his thoughts. The door swung open, and a woman entered. Raskolnikov's heart skipped a beat as she caught his eye. It was Sonia, the woman he had encountered before, the one who seemed to see right through him, who always had a kind word to offer despite her own struggles. Her presence brought a flicker of recognition, but Raskolnikov quickly turned his gaze away, his pulse quickening. He couldn't let her see him like this. She couldn't know what he had done. Sonia walked past him without a second glance, as if unaware of the storm raging inside him. He felt an odd mix of relief and dread. The encounter was brief, but it was enough to remind him of the world outside, a world he had just stepped out of. But he couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape what he had done. The guilt would follow him wherever he went. It was in his bones, in his heart, in his very soul. Part 3. The Stranger's Gaze. Raskolnikov's heart raced as he sat there in the cafe, his mind spiraling with thoughts of guilt and dread. The moments with Sonia seemed to hang in the air like a shadow, her presence a reminder of a life he could never return to. Why had she come in at that very moment? As the door closed behind her, he felt a fleeting sense of relief, as though her departure meant he was once again safe. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was never safe. The weight of what he had done pressed upon him, each breath a struggle. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a screech. The noise startled a few patrons in the cafe, but Raskolnikov paid them no mind. His mind was elsewhere, torn between his past and present, between the man he was and the monster he had become. Without thinking, he pushed open the door and stepped back into the cold streets. The chill of the evening air hit him like a slap, but it did little to clear the fog in his mind. His steps were slow, measured, as though he were walking through a dream, one that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. He walked without purpose, his eyes scanning the streets, but his mind was distant. The city felt empty, hollow, as though it no longer belonged to him. The world was turning, but he was stuck in place, frozen by his own actions. As he wandered, he passed by a street corner and glanced up, only to meet the gaze of a man across the street. The stranger's eyes locked with his, and for a split second, Raskolnikov felt something, a flicker of recognition, an unspoken understanding. But the stranger quickly looked away, and Raskolnikov continued on, unsure of what had just happened. Had the man seen something in him? Had he noticed the darkness inside? Raskolnikov shook his head, trying to clear the thought from his mind. He couldn't afford to be paranoid, but the encounter stuck with him. He couldn't escape the sensation that his every move was being watched, that the eyes of the city were on him, judging him for what he had done. Was this how it would always be now? A life where every glance, every moment, felt like a trap? Where every step he took felt like a march toward his inevitable downfall? He found himself at a bridge overlooking the river, the water below moving steadily in the moonlight. The calmness of the scene felt in stark contrast to the storm raging within him. Was there any way out of this? Could he ever escape the weight of his crimes, or was he doomed to be haunted by them forever? Raskolnikov leaned over the railing, his fingers gripping it tightly as he gazed into the dark water below. The thought of disappearing, of ending it all, crossed his mind, but even as the idea surfaced, he recoiled. It wasn't the solution. It was never the solution. But in that moment, as he stared into the river's depths, he couldn't help but wonder if his punishment would be something worse than death. The torment of living with his guilt, the knowledge that he had taken 2 lives, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Part 4. The Unraveling Mind. The night air grew colder as Raskolnikov stood at the bridge, his mind spiraling deeper into madness. He had thought that by walking, by distancing himself from the scene of the crime, he could escape the suffocating weight of guilt that pressed down on him. But the harder he tried to flee, the more it consumed him. His thoughts were a chaotic mess of fragmented memories and paranoid delusions. He thought he saw the faces of Alyona and Lizaveta in the dark shadows that danced on the river's surface. Their eyes, empty, accusing, stared back at him, relentless. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, trying to ground himself, but the pain only seemed to make the ache in his chest worse. How could he go on living like this? Raskolnikov knew that the only way out was to confront the truth, to acknowledge what he had done. But that meant facing the consequences, the horror of losing everything he had once believed in. How could he live with the fact that he had killed, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return? His breathing grew more erratic, and his vision blurred. Every thought felt like a scream inside his head. The river before him seemed to mock him, its currents swirling as if pulling him toward the same abyss that threatened to swallow him from within. He couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was closing in on him. With a jolt, he stumbled back from the railing, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let the guilt take him. He couldn't lose control, couldn't let his mind completely unravel. He turned away from the water and began to walk, though his steps were unsteady, his legs weak. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Was he losing his grip on reality? Was this what madness felt like? The pressure to confess was mounting, but so was the fear of facing what was coming, of what he had become. Every street he passed seemed to close in on him, as if the city itself had become a prison. He was a stranger here now, not just to the people he encountered, but to himself. Who had he been before this? The man he had once been seemed like a distant memory, a shadow of someone he could never reach again. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a familiar voice calling his name. He froze. It was Sonia. She stood a few steps away, her face full of concern. But there was something else there too, something softer, like an understanding that no one else seemed to have. "Sonia," Raskolnikov whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't know why he said her name, but the sight of her felt like a lifeline. Or maybe it was just the last shred of something human he could cling to. Sonia's eyes softened as she approached him slowly. "Raskolnikov," she said gently, her voice full of warmth. "Are you all right?" His heart thudded painfully in his chest. She couldn't know. She couldn't see through him, through the darkness that had taken root inside. Yet, despite himself, Raskolnikov felt a flicker of hope, a brief, almost impossible thought that maybe, just maybe, she could help him. I'm not okay," he confessed, his voice trembling. For the first time since the murders, he let his guard down, allowing someone to see the cracks in his armor. But he couldn't stop the overwhelming wave of guilt that surged inside him, threatening to drown him once more. Part 5. The Confession. Raskolnikov stood there, frozen, as Sonia approached him. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and compassion, bore into him, cutting through the layers of guilt and self-loathing he had built around himself. She was standing too close, her presence too soft, too human, and he could feel the cracks in his resolve begin to widen. I don't know what to do anymore, Sonia," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his admission. The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but they were finally out. They had been suffocating him for so long. Sonia's gaze softened, and she took a small step forward, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it an unspoken promise, an understanding that Raskolnikov had never dared to hope for. "Raskolnikov, I know you're suffering," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't have to bear this burden alone. You don't have to carry it forever." For a moment, Raskolnikov couldn't speak. He couldn't comprehend what she was offering. She was talking about forgiveness, redemption, something he thought had been beyond him. How could he ask for forgiveness after what he had done? How could he expect anyone to understand? I can't undo it, Sonia," he murmured, his eyes filled with torment. "I can't go back and fix it. They're dead. I took their lives, and now I can't live with myself. I can't escape what I've done." Sonia's hand tightened around his arm, pulling him gently toward her. "You don't have to fix it alone. But you have to confess, Raskolnikov. You have to face what you've done. Only then can you begin to heal. His heart twisted painfully in his chest. Confess? The word seemed alien, too final, too irrevocable. He had spent so long running from the truth, hiding from the reality of his crime. How could he bring himself to confess? How could he expose the darkness that had taken over his soul? But Sonia's eyes, those soft, understanding eyes, seemed to hold a flicker of hope, hope that he had long ago lost. I can't go on like this, he whispered, his breath ragged. I can't live with the lies, with the weight of what I've done. But I'm scared, Sonia. I'm scared of what will happen if I confess. I'm scared of losing everything. Sonia's voice was gentle but firm. The truth will set you free, Raskolnikov. It may be hard, it may be terrifying, but in the end, it's the only way you'll find peace. You can't carry this burden forever. You need to let it go. The words echoed in his mind as he looked at her, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him even harder. Sonia had spoken the truth, but it was a truth that felt like a knife to his chest. How could he face the consequences of his actions? Could he ever come to terms with what he had done? Raskolnikov felt the tears welling up in his eyes, a flood of emotion he had long suppressed breaking free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to feel, really feel, the depth of his guilt, his shame, his despair. I'll confess, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'll do it. I have to. I don't know how to live with myself anymore. I have to face the truth, no matter how much it hurts. Sonia's face softened, a mixture of relief and sorrow crossing her features. You're not alone, Raskolnikov. I'll be with you, every step of the way. Raskolnikov nodded, feeling the first flicker of hope stir inside him. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that for the first time, he was ready to face it, to confront the truth, and to begin his long, painful journey toward redemption.